And the other thing I will say that may come into play here, as I'm going to be your moderator today, is that I'm also an official. I'm a Port Commissioner for Chelan County, which is the Economic Development Agency for Chelan County. If you want to know why the Chelan County has a port and we don't have ocean access, we can talk about that later. We do have an airport, but we also do the economic recruitment for businesses who want to locate in Chelan County. And sometimes, amazingly enough, the tax structure of the state comes up in those discussions with businesses located out of state. They don't quite know what to do on tax sometimes. So I'm sure we'll get to that as we move forward. This is the state tax issues panel, so it's like college, you know, you're psychology 101, and oh gosh, it's a college. So if you're in the wrong place, you can leave gracefully, you're just stuck with us. One or the other, it's up to you. Taxes certainly is always an important issue. I think even more so today, states are looking at another year with big deficits as they go to Olympia here in just a few months. And we're in a recession, and dollars are tight for both governments, for businesses, for individuals. So state taxes always come to the fore. You know, we have, I got a call here a month or two ago, you know, was it Forbes that had the great list, you know, that Washington State is the #2 state to do business in, the Forbes magazine, something like that. So another chamber director of my neck of the woods calls me up, and how do we come out as #2? How does this work? And I said, well, I think the short answer is they don't know what to do with the income tax, they just don't include it in kind of the calculation. Now, something comes from the tax system here is really positive for business. So certainly it's an issue that affects us all the time here in the state. And again, the goal for today is to get some, we're going to get some brainstorming, get some ideas about how to reform the system, or it needs to be reformed, and then prioritizing at the end. And you've already been through, I hope you've still got your, you saw your dots in the first session, that's bad form. So hopefully you've got your 5 dots in the second session, and we'll use those right at the end. We've got 2 speakers that are going to start off talking about these issues, and then we'll open up general discussion and take some kind of policy suggestions down, and we'll be recording those and put them on the wall, and then get a chance to go at the end. You probably all know that because you've already been through it before. But anyway, we'll do it again. And with that, I'll introduce you 2 speakers that we have. First is Amber Carter from AWB, and which is the Association of Washington Business. She'll go first, followed by Jason Mercier from the Washington Policy Center. And with that, please welcome them, and I'll let them get going.
The first issue I really want to put on your platform is taxes in general. This is a different dynamic from the 2010 session than it was in 2009. In 2009, we had 2 things going for us that are not present today. With a $9 billion deficit, Governor Gregoire made a campaign pledge that she would not raise taxes. Now is not the time when our state facing a recession. The second thing we had going for us was we were still within the time frame of Initiative 960's first 2 years of passage. That is the initiative that said raising new taxes required a 2/3 vote majority. After 2 years, lawmakers can change that initiative with a simple majority. Last year, if they had the 2/3 to change it, they might as well just raise the tax because that's what it would take to raise the tax. Going into 2010, both of those issues have changed. The expiration period for modifying Initiative 960 is gone after January 1, so lawmakers can change it with a simple majority, and there is already talk and pressure from various stakeholder groups to do so. The pledge by Governor Gregoire has been altered. At an AWB policy summit back in September, she was making a statement that the door is now open to lawmakers to bring her a tax the public would support. So I hope that #1 recommendation from this group would be to not raise taxes in the 2010 session. Now I'd like to get down to some nitty-gritty details from there. The first is the reseller's permit. Last session, in the last 10 days of the 2009 session, lawmakers had about a $100 million gap between the House and Senate budget. And that's where Senate Bill 6173 came into play. It had not been introduced until the last 10 days, quickly got a hearing, and it would have changed our worlds dramatically had it not been amended in the House. In its original form, every business that sells products for resale would have had to collect the tax, pay it up front, and then seek a refund modified it so that the majority of businesses would be automatically issued a permit from the Department of Revenue if they had a good track record of collecting sales tax and remitting it to the state. Contractors were treated substantially different, however. Unlike the 4-year permit that regular businesses can have, contractors are allowed only a 1-year permit before they have to get it reissued by the Department of Revenue. We've worked really closely with DOR over the summer months to implement that new law, create an application and a permit that is reasonable for employers to use. There is still more work that needs to be done, however. Department of Revenue will have agency request legislation in 2010 to further refine this act and make it more usable for all involved. Specifically, they are recommending changes to the reseller permit for contractors so that they can have an automatic issuance for contractors, not just retailers and wholesalers and service companies, and that by 2013, contractors will have a 2-year life cycle allowed for that permit. So we hope that you will support making those changes and make recommendations to improve the existing resellers permit, particularly for contractors. The third issue I'd like to speak about is veto tax centralization. We work very closely with the agency over the last couple of months as they developed a request package for 2010. And right now, sitting on Governor Gregoire's desk is a draft bill by the Department of Revenue that would study the implementation of a central veto tax collection system in Washington State. So all 38 cities that have a local veto tax would have to be administered by the Department of Revenue under the recommendations of the study. Yes, this is a moving moment. Definitely a moving moment. I think we've been struggling with this for at least the last couple of decades. In 1995, when we saw the model ordinance language passed the legislature that basically said cities that have a veto tax have to have uniform definitions, uniform tax treatment, and then 3 years later, the cities were just going on and doing whatever they felt like doing and disregarding the law altogether. So getting a central veto tax collection system and the study started is the first step forward to making that change. The cities are aggressively opposing this recommendation by the Department of Revenue to have an agency request bill. They're contacting the governor, asking the governor to reject a study on centralizing the veto tax system. Now, normally, studies, you can just go ahead and do it anyway. You can have an executive order or some other means of just doing it, whether it's legislative or agency-driven. But because it requires the data from these cities that have local veto taxes, a law is necessary to require the information before funding in a centralization study. So if you're interested in that moving moment becoming reality, I would ask that you contact Governor Gregoire now and ask him to support the agency request legislation to study a centralized veto tax system in our state. The final area that I want to mention is economic development in general. Our state tax structure often impedes economic development decisions in our state, whether it's locally made or statewide. For staying here, growing here, and attracting companies to our state. We're talking about the Forbes business kind of landing, where they just really disregard the tax structure of our state and only look at the positives. And there are many positives in our state, but our tax structure leaves a little to be desired at times. There are 2 tax incentives in particular I'd like to mention as economic development tools, but I don't think they're getting their fair shake on usability. The first is the manufacturing sales and use tax incentive. We have a sales and use tax incentive right now for companies who purchase and manufacture equipment. There are a lot of interpretations, however, that have been issued by the Department of Revenue since that law was enacted back in the early 90s that really prevent it from being a good economic development tool. An example of that is prototype development. Unless it's that last one before sure product gets developed, you're not covered. And that's going to certainly make it a much better tool if you're kind of gotcha with your tax incentive at the end of the day. We'd also like to see that incentive be modeled to expand it for data centers and to cover data center decisions. as well as other capital-intensive industries such as telecommunications as a way of promoting building in our state and increasing our broadband capacity in areas that might not otherwise see that opportunity. The final incentive is R&D, research and development tax credit. Likewise, with data center connection, this incentive has been very useful in attracting businesses to our state, growing jobs in our state, and these are high-wage jobs that result from these kinds of investments with benefits. I can give you statistic after statistic that shows these incentives work. The R&D tax incentive is set to expire in 2015. Without action by lawmakers, we run the risk of losing that economic development tool. And if we wait until 2013 or 2014 or God forbid 2015, we're sending the message to those companies that, we might want you here, we might not. We'll wait and see. While virtually every other state in the nation is sharpening the saw and increasing these incentives to attract companies to their locations, poaching off of the very businesses that are here today. So with that, I think I'll go ahead and hand over.
As short as the ceiling, I'm going to stand so I'm sitting a bit on my head. This working group has a very important task. The governor has challenged this group in particular to recommend ways to reform the B&O tax. Every year since she took office, she has asked the business community and policymakers at large, I don't like the B&O. I know that it's a bad way to administer taxes on businesses. I know it hurts our competitiveness nationally. I know it's not the most predictable, easy to understand tax that we have in the state. So I would like to reform it. Show me how to reform it. Fortunately, nobody has been able to come back and offer recommendation other than a corporate income tax or a personal income tax. Those are the two fallbacks that have been provided to the government. So one of my hopes that when we get to our ranking, you will be sympathetic to the proposal the policy center has come up with and recommend that the legislature consider this alternative to an income tax on personal or corporate or the per B&O. There's a couple of also short-term fixes that Amber mentioned that we'll hopefully make on. First of all, before I even spend any time on this, is there anybody who likes the per B&O? Is there anybody who would prefer the corporate income tax? Personal income tax? Okay, so with these survey results, it means there needs to be an alternative way, and that's what we're proposing. In your packet, these are proposals. In the front tab, you can pull it out. Basically what we did is at the governor's request, we talked to a bunch of economists across the country and asked them, if we were going to start from scratch, how would we design the tax system? And talking to 10 economists, I got 10 different answers on how to design a tax system. It wasn't much help. The next question we asked ourselves is, well, let's look at the best way to improve our economy, the best way to create jobs. How would we design a system that would create large economic growth and large job creation? We identified 4 different models to try to get some economic model on. That was the corporate income tax, to see if that was a viable proposal. A repeal of the B&O and a corresponding expansion of the sales tax. Flattening the current B&O down to just one rate. Or a variation of the Texas franchise tax, gross receipts based upon the margin versus each business activity. Now, unfortunately, none of those options gave us the shining light on how to create jobs. They all kind of came back with the same numbers. The sales tax actually showed a decrease of around 800 jobs and a decrease of about $160 million in disposable income per capita. So not a model you want to do, especially when you think about the border states and border cities. You add sales tax at the state level approaching 9%. Now, the flat B&O tax, again, not the best numbers. It actually showed a job loss of 400 jobs and a loss of $92 million in disposable income. Now, not a surprise when you listen here, the corporate income tax model works. That was a job loss of over 8,000 jobs, $856 million in lost disposable income. The one that actually showed an increase was the Texas franchise tax. Nominal increase of around 200 jobs, $26 million in disposable income. So based on those numbers, since we weren't being showed an economic case for making one of the switches, we turned our attention to, well, we're going to start from scratch in the tax system to be based upon sound tax principles. And the ones that we use to guide our decision simplicity, can you understand? You understand what the average person is understanding, the business owner is understanding what the policymakers trying to administer. Accountability. Same issues. Are you being accountable to the businesses? Are you being accountable to the taxpayers for that revenue? Or are you able to game the system? Economic neutrality. Not treating one employer differently than another employer and how you use taxes. Equity. Same issue again. Not treating one employer differently than another employer as far as taxes. Complementary. Are you making a state system a complication of local taxes? That's kind of what Amber was going to have with centralization. The competitiveness. You don't want to institute a system that's going to make you rank even worse on the floor rank if you understand our tax systems. No, but you want somebody who will compete for jobs without having any special credits. Finally, reliability is the stable tax, not necessarily on collections, but for employers. You want to know year to year, quarter, how the tax is going to be done. Based upon those, we can also variation of the tax branch. Now, so that we don't end up in the same problem that we have with the D&O, this is a constitutional framework. You can't just pass a statutory change. This is be constitutional. There are protections for employers and taxpayers. The proponents for a constitutional reform is this new gross receipts margin tax will be the only tax to be levied on employers. You couldn't have debt taxes, couldn't have parking taxes, couldn't have utility taxes. This is the only bite of the apple. Still will be subject to property, still subject to sales, and no other tax on business activities. All existing taxes, not like you add new ones, all existing business taxes. This new gross receipts margin tax will be the only tax on employers. Counties would continue to be prohibited from levying them. The cities would have their own. So the only two entities that would be taxed would be the local city jurisdiction or the state. And the way this gross receipts margin tax would work is you would take your total receipts and you would have two standard deductions, either a compensation deduction that would pay your employees and your partnerships, CEOs, or a cost of production deduction, your overhead and your materials, any costs related to the production of that service or that. And there would also be a slight discount schedule. For some of the small businesses and startups with low profit margin, once the margin is trillion, you have a sliding schedule determining what percentage of that tax is owed. These examples are in the handout here. And finally, to make sure that the rate doesn't increase, to get to the predictability issue, tax increases would require a 2/3 vote, the legislative body, or vote approval, which is the current statutory law that General was talking about, which is now 60, rather than leaving that to the whim of the legislature to appeal the majority vote that we're talking about the Constitution. This would be the constitutional framework as a whole. It's not ready to go into this next session because there's a lot of questions that we need to be answered as far as how do you define as deduction, compensation, and deduction. The other element of this is because you would be going to one flat rate, just the average, you would be charging employers different rates. You would be repealing the current credits and exemptions. So that would lower that rate even more and make it basically rather unusual. Secondly, we would be communicating to businesses in state and out of state, whether you're buying, the baker, agriculture, whatever it is, you're being treated with the same tax rate and all determination as far as pays on your margins. Now let me give you an example of how this will be calculated. In your handout in the back is the calculator used in Texas. The way they determine it is you take the lowest of your tax liability based upon these three variations. Take your total margin and then you deduct your compensation costs. That would be one margin. Another way that you would determine is you take your total receipts and you subtract your production costs. And the final one is your tax liability cannot be in excess of 60% of your receipts. So of those three options, whichever one has the lowest liability, that's the one with the tax margin to apply to this. Now the apportionment factor and the nexus will then determine how much of that tax will be paid to which jurisdiction. Now, in the handout you have here is a sliding example of discounts. So for example, if that margin was $1,000, you wouldn't owe any tax. If your margin was up to $300,000, you only owe 10% of the tax. Going up to $1 million. Now, Going back to the economists, it says, why would we do this? The grocery fees will understand, is this an improvement for the court system? Even though it's still a grocery fees tax, the analysis from the economists that we dealt with is it would be an improvement. Getting away from some of the complexity of it, especially if you're centralized administration. So the only point of contact this would have would be with the Department of Revenue. When you're dealing with the cities, you have the city rate, your tax will be paid to the Department of Revenue, and they would do that administration for the cities. Obviously, this is a pretty radical change in the current business application. This is a longer-term conversation. It's something that we will be discussing over the next 3 to 5 years while making the short-term changes that we have discussed. The most important of those is the centralization. What we need to do is be able to get down to just that one point of contact where not having to fight with the state and localities and how the tax is administered. Centralization will be critical this session, and the facilitator moves to this replacement of the B&O with the gross receipts from our systems. The other one is a better definition of nexus and apportionment, so that you're not doing over 100% of the receipts from the field. Well, the final thing that we would like to see happen also, hopefully we'll get into the rankings, and that is the transparency website on your tax liability that you currently have. Last year, the state enacted the budget transparency website. It's called fiscal.law.gov. You can go there and you can see all the money the state spends, where it's spent, what programs, what activities, and results. That address of the spending side of it. What we'd like to see happen is that same type of transparency by attachments. You as an employer or as an individual go to the website, type in your zip code and find out what taxes are subject to, what rates. That would also help determine some of the competitive histories from tax jurisdictions. You can see what your liability would be based upon what you decide to go for. So long term, we'd like to see the conversation that the B&O doesn't need to be reformed, it doesn't need to be replaced. That the income tax needs to be the corporate and personal level. It's not the way to go. There's another path, that's a variation of Texas franchise tax, which is laid out for in the handout. In the short term, improving the centralization numbers, improving the apportionment of tax efforts, and improving the transparency of the current tax rates. I also have information for a short tax panel. To answer the governor's call, if there is a way to replace the B&O, it doesn't have to be the income, it doesn't have to be the corporate or personal. We believe this is the best direction to go ahead to improve the state's competitiveness while addressing some of the complexity and complication that the B&O taxes have on current employers. I'm happy to answer the questions.